Real? Yes, it is. Welcome, everybody. My name is Caitlin. I'm the events coordinator at Square Books. So glad everyone can join us this evening to celebrate, talk about, cry about What Strange Paradise, written by Omar El Akkad. And he is joined in conversation by the wonderful Elena Passarello. But before I hand it off to them, I wanted to do just a little bit of Square Books housekeeping, not too much. So just a couple upcoming events. First of all, for you locals or kind of regional folks joining us, don't forget that Saturday, August 21st in downtown Jackson, Mississippi is the Mississippi Book Festival. It's a literary lawn party. Lots of Oxford writers are going to be there, really writers from all over the country. Last year it was all virtual. It's all back in person. It's going to be fun. Again, August 21st in Jackson. Go say hi to our friends at Lemuria. Then on the 31st of August, that's a Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Time, we will be back on Zoom for our latest installation of the Crossroads book group, kind of a back to school theme. We'll be hosting Adam Harris in conversation with Claire Howarth for The State Must Provide, Why Colleges Have Always Been Unequal and How to Set Them Right. Clint Smith calls it an invaluable text from a supremely talented writer, and being a college town, I think it's an incredibly relevant book, and I hope that y'all can join us, whether you are in Oxford or not, or went to college or not. We are so excited to have him. Then last one, and I'll get it out of the way, Wednesday, 6 p.m., September 1st at Off Square Books. So this is an in-person event for now. We'll be hosting Maurice Carlos Ruffin. He was the 2020 and 2021 Grisham Writer in Residence at the university. And we didn't really get to welcome him last year. So we are excited to welcome him in September for his new story collection, Those Who Don't Say They Love You. These stories are intimate invitations to hear, witness, and imagine lives that are once regional but largely universal, but undeniably New Orleanian, written by a lifelong resident of New Orleans, though we consider him an honorary Oxonian. Keep in mind that this event will have limited occupancy, socially distanced seating, masks are required. But enough about them. I would like to tell you a little more about Omar and Elena. Omar El Akkad was born in Cairo, Egypt, and grew up in Doha, Qatar, until he moved to Canada with his family. He is an award-winning journalist and author who has traveled around the world to cover many of the most important news stories of the last decade. His reporting includes dispatches from the NATO-led war in Afghanistan, the military trials at Guantanamo Bay, the Arab Spring revolution in Egypt, and the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson, Missouri. He is a recipient of Canada's National Newspaper Award for Investigative Reporting and the Gough Penny Memorial Prize for Young Canadian Journalists, as well as 3 National Magazine Award honorable mentions. He lives in Portland, Oregon. We are so happy to welcome him back. Some of you may remember that we hosted him for his first novel, American War, which was an instant Square Books bestseller. And the lovely lady on the screen is essayist and performer Elena Passarello, the author of Let Me Clear My Throat and Animals Strike Poses, which was a New York Times book review editor's choice. Her most recent essays have appeared in Audubon, McSweeney's, National Geographic, and Paris Review. You can hear her on her weekly PRX radio variety show, Livewire. Phew. All right, 2 very accomplished, wonderful people to talk about a very wonderful and important book. Those of y'all joining us, please submit questions in the Q&A, and I will come back later to moderate this. But in the meantime, I think y'all are really in for a treat. Thank you both so much for joining us. Truly such a pleasure and an honor to have you on our Zoom screen. Okay, enough from me. Y'all have fun.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Hi.
Hi, Omar. How's it going?
It's good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I feel like the last time I saw you, you had on like a video game headset and we were trying to make like a high def radio recording, but now you seem like you're in maybe a more studious part of your house.
Yeah, the last 2 times we did anything together was the Oregon Book Awards. which they have us co-host virtually. And then I don't know why they keep asking us back.
I know.
Genuinely, I'm not sure. It's such an amateur hour. I mean, at least you have a background in this. And so you're like slowly like dragging me along, dragging this dead weight.
No.
But for some reason they keep asking us back. I don't know if you have like something you're blackmailing them with, but yes, it's
It's
always
sort of
excellent.
like when David Letterman would have people on that had no business being on television, like Harvey Pekar, the great cartoonist. That's sort of, or like that guy Buzz who like worked downstairs. I feel like that's kind of what the Oregon Book Awards has decided for the pandemic, because they can't have actual hosts. They just
Yes. I think that's incredibly accurate. I'm amazed that you agreed to do this. Thank you. And I'm amazed that the folks at Square Books had me back. The last time I did this for this book I wrote a while back called American War, I was on the book tour, and I come into town, and at this point my publicist had realized just how sort of flighty I was, and so put me in this hotel where you literally couldn't get lost. To go from the hotel to the bookstore, you walk outside the front door, you make a left, you walk for 10 minutes. That's it. That's the only thing you have to do. So what do? I walk out the hotel door, I take a right, walk for 30 minutes,
oh no.
like completely not, at one point there's like tumbleweeds and like old-timey hot air balloons. Like it's clear I'm not going into town. Like it's clear I'm headed in the other direction.
You walked
And
to
so finally
Tennessee.
this like occurs to me, I turn around and run back. I was an hour late for my event. It's the worst I've ever screwed up. And yet they were still the most generous to me of any bookstore I've been to.
Was
So
there
I'm
anybody
grateful that
there when you
sorry?
showed up? Was there anyone there?
Yeah, I'm wondering if they were there for like the next event or something, and we're just too embarrassed to leave. Yeah, thank you. That's very kind. They yeah, it was a great crowd. It was great questions, and afterwards, they I kept asking to see Faulkner's grave because I'm a tourist, and they took me out. It was a really great night, but I started out by completely screwing up the event,
Must
and
be
yet they've
so
agreed to
nervous.
have me back. So that's very nice of them.
I can definitely feel the Oxford love, even in this virtual room, even though you and I are 2 time zones away from Square Books. I can feel it. Um, yeah, so maybe let's see. I really enjoyed reading this book so much. It brought so much to the time that I spent with it. I have this thing that happens. I try not to like jinx it, but every once in a while, I call it the Zora effect, because when I was 16 years old, I read Their Eyes Were Watching God. And when I got to the last page of the book, the only thing I wanted to do was flip the book back over and see the beginning. Just there was this compulsion, and it's not very frequent, but I definitely felt that way with the way that I have goosebumps just thinking about it, with like the way that this book brought me to its close. I wanted to just rewind and start it again and just see kind of how far I have been able to go with these characters and with this concept and with this issue. So it's a Zora certified.
So that's high praise. Thank you. That means a lot. Appreciate it.
And I have so many questions about the making of the book, and also kind of how one prepares to cover an issue like this in like a literary fashion. But I thought maybe we could start kind of way back, because this is your second novel. But I also know that novels aren't necessarily published in the order that they're written. Sometimes authors will start a novel and then start another one, and that's the one that gets published or whatever. But can you tell me a little bit about where this showed up on your timeline as a novelist and a short story writer?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, thank you for that. That's very kind.
Sure.
I I was a journalist for 10 years. I was working up at the Globe and Mail in Canada, which is a national newspaper up there. Um, but fiction's been sort of my first home for a long time. And so during the course of those 10 years, I wrote 3 novels before American War.
Oh,
And the sort of technical literary term for them is hot garbage, I think. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to look it up. But just not the sort of thing that you would. My poor best friend Anna is the person who's my first reader on all my manuscripts. She's the only person who's read these 3. Um, and so I'd write them, I'd get to the last page, realize that it was completely just broken, and save it on the hard drive and move on.
Mm.
And that's what I did with American War. I finished American War, and then it sat on the hard drive for months and months. And then I had a bad day at work. I had a day where I felt like I was just rewriting press releases. And I thought, to hell with this. I emailed a literary agent who I'd met randomly 8 years earlier.
Huh?
And I just said, hey, I know it's every literary agent's worst nightmare when a journalist says, I have a novel for you, but I have a novel for you. Would you mind taking a look? She agrees. 3 days later, she says, I like it. I know this guy who might like it as well. His name is Sonny. Look him up. So I look up Sonny, who ends up being Sonny Mehta, the head of Knopf, and I think, okay, we're wasting our time. This is, and then for months we hear nothing. And then in the fall of that year, it's like a one-line email, like, I like it, or something like that. And they made us an offer, and I won the lottery. I got incredibly, incredibly lucky. But this one, I had started putting together during the last days of the editing process of American War. And then it went on for years of just sort of, it went through all kinds of different iterations. And every time I would rewrite it, it would get a little bit shorter. And I think if I kept going, it would be an even shorter book. I needed it to be that. I needed it to be like really sort of close camera, and not sprawling, which is the opposite of American War, because American War is a kitchen sink book. It's got all kinds of stuff going on in there. And this is very sort of, it's quiet, it's direct, and it doesn't do that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, I started writing it in the very early days of American War becoming a thing.
Mhm.
And then I finished it in the days of lockdown, basically. We were putting the final edits.
I
There's very
remember.
different, like 6 or 7 different lives that I went through over the course of writing the book.
That's got to be such a vertigo as a novelist who's been working on novels for decades, to then have, I see this with bands sometimes, like musical groups, where like the or actors, the work of art that you make after you're fully aware that your works of art are being observed by someone who isn't like you and your mom or whatever, or your friend Anna.
Yeah. Yep.
So, and in order to sort of keep your aesthetic consciousness while that shift is happening, must have required some kind of strategy, or maybe just denial. What was the?
It's weird because when I was writing American War, it was the angry voice in my head was one that I was used to because I'd been hearing it for a long time, which is you're wasting your time. What are you doing? This is never going to get anywhere. And then I'd been talking to that guy a lot, and so like I was familiar with that, and it's fine. And you wake up every day and you're like, okay, cool, yes, absolutely, I'm going to do it anyway. And I thought once American War came out and got decent reviews, it did okay. Like it wasn't a complete disaster. And I thought the voice would go away, and instead it was just like you had one in you. Stop wasting your time. You're done. This is a one-hit wonder sort of thing. And so I was contending with a slightly different voice that was coming from the same sort of malicious, unhelpful place. And you think, I mean, like this certainly got a much better review in the New York Times than I thought it would, and sort of, I don't think it's going to set the world on fire or anything, but it did by my standards really well. And I can already hear the voice starting to switch to like, okay, quit while you're ahead, buddy. The next one's going to be a flop. Like, so it's a slightly different sort of waste of brain power to deal with that, because the tone is slightly different, or the specifics are slightly different. But I know the place it's coming from. I know the kind of well of insecurity that these buckets keep coming out of. So it's not a stretch to do the same response, which is like, yeah, you're right, probably, but we're gonna plow ahead anyway.
Go to bed. I've got work to do.
Exactly.
Well, and then this is fascinating to me because, like you said, American War, in terms of structure, in terms of approach, in terms of time, American War takes place in a somewhat more distant future, and there's a very now, even though the chapters of What Strange Paradise are called before and after, sort of alternating between, it feels very now. It feels, like we're thinking about the crisis of displaced people around the planet. But and then also just in terms of structure, or in terms of size, right? Like this is a compact book. it doesn't want the kitchen sink to be a part of it, I don't think. And you said just now that you needed it to be short. I saw on Twitter that you were calling it a repurposed fable. And I think of fables as not particularly long if they want to be successful. So maybe this is a great sort of entry point to talk kind of about the plot and the focus of the book and why this fable-like, I don't know if that's a word or not. I don't know, I just made it up.
It sounds really pretty. I'm gonna try to use that at some point.
Fable-like, or this sort of brevity, this compactness, this spareness, why that spoke to this particular novel, this idea that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. I should start by explaining what the hell this book is about. It occurred to me that I haven't done that. So yeah, it's in my mind, it's a repurposed fable. It's the story of Peter Pan, reinterpreted as a tale of a contemporary child refugee. It opens with a migrant shipwreck on the shores of this unnamed Western island, that is very much based on Crete, but I changed the details enough to make it a sort of fantasy place. And in fact, I still have my when we went to line edits on this, I still have all the notes from the copy editors being like, "Hey, are you sure you spelled the name of this flower right? I can't find it on Google anywhere." Because all the flora and fauna is made up on this island. But anyway,
sun hats or sun heads, the birds.
yeah, exactly. These birds that don't exist anywhere. So it starts with this child, this 9-year-old child named Amir, who's washed up on the shore of this island, the only survivor of a migrant shipwreck across the Mediterranean. And as soon as he opens his eyes, the security forces that are trying to cordon off the site of the shipwreck notice that there's a survivor. They come chasing after him. He runs away, runs through this forest, and immediately basically stumbles onto the house of this 15-year-old girl named Vanna, who decides in the moment to take him in and hide him from these people. And from that point on, it sort of fluctuates between the before and after chapters. So it alternates. The before chapters show you everything that led up to how Amir ended up on this island, and the after chapters are everything that happened after he ends up on the island. It's one of those books that, depending on how familiar you are with the two epigraphs, it's a very different read, which is a super self-indulgent, like conceited writer thing to say, but for whatever it's worth, like structurally, it's very much based on two pieces of writing. One of them being the original Peter Pan, and it started the first time I remember thinking about the stuff that eventually congealed into this novel was 2012. I was on assignment in Egypt. I was covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and I was riding around with an old high school friend of mine who was complaining about rent. Rent is too high. Rent is too high. And at one point, I asked him, "So what? Okay, what's the price? What's the rent for an apartment in your building, for example?" And he said, "Well, do you mean the Syrians price or the locals price?" And I said, "What the hell's the Syrians price?" And he said, "Well, we've been having this influx of people showing up here, and they don't have any choice, so you can squeeze them for all they're worth, because what are they going to do? Go somewhere else?" And it quickly became apparent that this was like not just for apartments. It was if you went down to the fruit and vegetable stall or something, it was the same deal. So I was thinking about that notion of, so long as there's a bedrock of an exploitable population, everyone will exploit that population one way or another. And then a couple of years later, I was reading the story about a shipwreck, a migrant shipwreck in the Mediterranean, and the details were about as horrific as you would expect. But what was sort of horrifying and fascinating after the fact was that this story generated all of this outrage for about 24 hours. And then everybody moved on to the next thing. And so this book is written very much against that privilege of temporary forgetting. I very much wanted to dwell. Whether I achieved any of this stuff is an entirely separate story, but that's what was going on in my head when I started putting the book together.
I think that, one ways in which it's effective that I noticed, Omar, is in this structure where the first image is this image of this young boy who is post shipwreck, like many just terribly grave images that, we certainly saw 2012, 2013, especially that image in 2015. that's a single moment, right? But then, and then we move forward to him like you said, like getting chased, but then we go backward to him before he's even gotten on the boat. And then in the next chapter, we have the next little section of the Greek Isle part where he's trying to find a place to hide, and he meets Vanna, his Wendy, I'm assuming. And then, but then we have to go back to him running and finding an opportunity to be on the boat. And then the long journey on this fishing boat toward the Mediterranean, it just shows up in these bits that like we were constantly regressing to. So the moment is just like, and the realities and the actualities, not just of Amir, but all the other people that were on the boat with him, including his uncle. And I don't want to give too much away. That it's like it, you already know what's going to happen on the first page to a significant portion of characters who then live out the last like week of their lives very slowly in front of us, which must have been excruciating to put together. Now that I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, structurally it's welded together. I mean, I have all of these sort of giant Bristol board things that I was putting notes on, and it doesn't mean it's a good book, don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean that this translates into literary excellence. It just means that like I spent a lot of time on the plumbing, like a lot of time. And it's again, it's one of those things. I keep talking about it as a repurposed fable. It's the story of Peter Pan, retold. But if you're not intimately familiar with Peter Pan going into this book, chances are you're not going to read it that way. As an example, so Vanna is the Wendy of this story. There's this probably apocryphal story about how the name Wendy came about. Apparently, it was not a much used name until J.M. Barrie used it in Peter Pan.
Huh.
And apparently, the way it came about was he had a childhood friend who kept wanting to call him friend, but couldn't pronounce the R, and so would say Wendy instead of friendy. And so Wendy apparently came from that. So Vanna, who's half Swedish, Van is apparently the Swedish word for friend. And so Van, the book is full of this kind of convoluted nonsense. I cannot stress enough how much of this stuff that doesn't matter in the slightest is buried in this book. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of kind of like structurally trying to put it together to fit my mission statement of taking this comforting fable that Westerners have been telling their kids for the past 100 years and inverting it. We talk about Peter Pan, we talk usually about like Peter Pan syndrome, the man who refuses to stop acting like a boy. Well, the origins of the story is that J.M. Barrie, when he was a kid, his older brother died in a skating accident, and it crushed the family. His mom never recovered, but one of the ways that she tried to comfort herself was to take comfort in the fact that he would never grow old. And so that's the origins of what goes on years later to be J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. So it's not the man who refuses to stop acting like a child. It's a child who never gets a chance to become a man. And so that's why it sort of fit for me structurally, but I didn't want it to get to the point where like, it's just a retelling of a story that everybody's seen the Disney movie of. Like I didn't want it to be that kind of relationship.
I think that's I think that's why talks like this are great, because sometimes they reveal, and I think it's totally okay for a writer to need to play a game with himself while he's putting together something that is kind of larger than comprehension, just in order to get it finished. I find that very helpful in my work too, to kind of like set a structure or set a challenge or sort of make a Sudoku of plot and illusion that that then serves as an engine, right? It serves as sort of a way to sort of get through, because obviously like in What Strange Paradise, the characters have monologues that speak to things like issues, right? Like things, they're saying things that are parts of conversations that we should be having right now about, what it means to say that you don't have room for people, or what it means for the West to sort of feel like it has either a responsibility or no responsibility, or what it means for two people who come from two completely different places to try to understand each other, even though things like trauma and tragedy make it in some respects kind of impossible for like a one-to-one kind of empathy. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be like stump the chump where like if you don't get it, then F. I feel like English classes teach us that, but really I think we should see it as these opportunities that writers take to get where they need to go in terms of whatever their inquiry is,
Yeah, I mean, um, it's weird because American War was this book that came out that I thought, Borges talks about this idea that all literature is tricks. And eventually, no matter how clever your tricks are, they get discovered, right? Well, my tricks are not particularly clever. I take a thing that's happening over there and I bring it over here. I invert. That's sort of my central literary trick. And I thought that with American War, it would be pretty clear what I was trying to do. The idea of using America as an overlay to tell somebody else's story. And instead, the book comes out 4 months into the Trump administration and is very much read as this is where we're headed. This is a prophecy of a second civil war. And that was great for book sales. It was great for my royalty statement, but it had almost nothing to do with the thing I intended, which again is fine. Like all this stuff outlives us, and you have to be okay with letting go of the curling rock and just watching it kind of take whatever path it's going to take.
Ooh, how very Canadian.
Right? That's my wife is an amateur curler.
Wow.
Too many of my metaphors are curling based and they do not work in the States. And yet I keep doubling down on you got to get it in the house. You can't stop at 4 feet. You got, and it's
my hunch is that there's
it,
not a lot of curling in Oxford, Mississippi.
Well, not with that attitude. I'm here as an ambassador. We're gonna make this happen. So you let this thing go. Anyway, curling is a sport that's played on the issues. And anyway, it's not important.
Oh, good.
Thank you, Square Books.
We've got like a Statler and Waldorf caliber comment stream happening, by the way, from Caitlin. So
this is great. I'm gonna figure out something. I'm gonna drop some piece of information that requires more advanced Googling at some point. Anyway, so this happens with American War. I intend it to be one thing. It becomes a whole bunch of different things. There was one blurb from a Texas indie bookstore where the bookseller said something like, "This novel shows why a second civil war would be brutal and bloody and why it's necessary." And I thought, really, that's what you got from this book? You thought I was advocating for, which again, yeah, when your name is Omar and you're a brown Muslim guy writing in America, it's not, you're already on thin ice with a book called American War. Anyway, I thought this wouldn't happen with What Strange Paradise. I thought the trick that I was trying to pull off from the epigraphs page was pretty clear, like from the get-go was pretty. And then I was talking about this with you earlier, the first 4 people who read, I think when I got to about the 4th draft, I showed the manuscript to 4 people. My friend Anna, who talked about, my agent's friend, and then another friend. And they all came back with entirely different interpretations of what the hell was going on in this book. And I've learned to love that. It used to be really jarring for me when I was younger, and I've learned to really appreciate that. But it's also the case where, like, there was a writer who was kind enough to blurb this book, and I was reading the blurb, and I was thinking, this is so generous and kind and so deviating from the thing that I thought I'd written, and I don't know what to do with that. Right? It's a strange place to be, but I do like it because I come from a long line of malfunctioning hearts. The men in my family sort of die very young, and whether that's going to happen to me or not, it is a mindset that you have when you put these things out of like, this is going to sit on the library shelf collecting dust years and years after I'm gone. And the idea that it could live many different lives is so weirdly comforting to me now, that it could be like different things to different people.
Well, that's the nature of a fable too, right? Like a tortoise and the hare means different things to different people, especially the hare, right?
So a while back, I was asked to write the intro for a new translation of Arabian Nights. It's this like giant sort of, first time it's been translated by an Arab woman. It's a really amazing piece of work, of which I did like the bare minimum. I did a 1.5 pages of work for this 1,000-page, Anyway, and I was thinking back to the first time my uncle had told me those stories, Alibaba, Sinbad, or whatever. And years later, actually reading the original stories, and realizing that there was never like a street fight between Alibaba and Sinbad, and there was no melee. Like he'd made the entire thing up because he didn't know the story either. Like he didn't know the details. Plus, he was telling it to like a 4-year-old, and so he had to like. And these things are pretty grim. So, like that the lie at the heart of it, and the many lies, the endless spectrum of lies that every fable is. I quite enjoy. I think it works well for this kind of story.
Well, I don't know if you'd agree with me in this transition that I'm about to deploy, like a curling disc skidding across. Never mind. But
yes, a curling disc. That's correct. Of course,
curling puck.
Disc.
But I would think that the opposite of fables is journalism, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not. But I'm sure you've been asked this a billion times, but this is not. And then you said that no editor or no publishing house mogul wants a journalist who's written a novel, which I didn't know that was a thing. Do all journalists secretly have novels like hidden in their desk drawers? But
the ones with any tact secretly have a novel. The ones with no tact very overtly have a novel.
Okay.
We'll try to get it in front of you. God damn it, Square Books is on the block.
I know, crushing it. So let's talk about this sort of intersection, or the lack of intersection, between your work as a journalist and your work writing novels, especially this one. It sounds like the fiction came first. Yeah, is that right?
Yeah, long before. When I was like 6 or something, that was when I was bitten.
But your first sort of professional experiences, like working professionally with editors, et cetera, is journalism. Is that right?
Yeah, journalism. So I grew up in Qatar. Qatar at the time had no public libraries, no bookstores. All the culture was imported and was pre-censored. So actually, somewhere around here, I still have my copy of 2 Nirvana albums, Nevermind and In Utero. And Nevermind, the baby on the cover is blacked out. And In Utero, the angel on the cover is blacked out.
Right.
And still remember, like, people have very different coming of age stories, but there's the whole like holding up magazines to the light to try and see what text and images the censor had deemed too dangerous for you. And so you're trying to like get a sense of what the hell's going on. And so early on, you associate reading in particular with a kind of rebellion, right? Like, someone powerful doesn't want me to do this, and so I'm definitely going to do it. So I was hooked on reading and writing as means of escape from a very early age. But I also come from the Middle East, and there's a particular kind of upper middle class Middle Eastern existence where you don't become a writer or a musician, or it's not what people do. It's not what grown-ups do. You become a lawyer or an engineer, So I ended up, when we moved to Canada, I ended up going to school for computer science. And because I'd seen the movie Hackers, and I thought that's what, I don't know if anyone here is considering a vocation or going to college. Don't do that. Please don't base your educational decisions on terrible mid-90s movies. Anyway, I go to the first class, CISC 101, computer science. No, CISC 100. 101 was if you knew anything about programming. 100 was for people who knew nothing. And they had us, the first assignment was to get this robot to go through a maze. So you do if hit wall, go left, if whatever, right? It wasn't even a real programming language. It was like Fisher Price, my first, And so I work on this thing for an hour. I hit run, the robot goes in circles, falls over. And it becomes clear that I don't know what the hell I'm doing. So I spent the rest of my university career at the student newspaper. I didn't go to class anymore. I barely got out with a degree. And I was lucky enough to have built up a portfolio. So I ended up at the Globe and Mail as an intern. They hired me on, and thank God they did, because I had no marketable skills. But the next 10 years were my real education. The first day at the Globe, this editor, Greg O'Neill, this guy who'd moved to Toronto from New Orleans, sits me down. He'd been there for 40 years. And he sits me down. He says, there's one thing we need every reporter to know. In this newspaper, reporters are gods, and all the editors are atheists. And it was his way of explaining to me that what they were about to do to my copy. Like, if you had one adjective, you were like, they were going to slash that thing, which was good for me because my writing's very purple and rambly, much as my answers are. But it was my education. And creative writing made me a better journalist. And journalists made the creative writing much tighter. They were sort of antagonistic muscles. And I was very lucky in that regard because I don't have a formal education in either field.
Do you find yourself sort of imagining the sort of editorial looming, at your atheistic editors when you're writing creative prose? Are they still kind of in the back of your head asking you to take the adjectives out and stuff?
Yeah, very much so. And thank God, because I mean, if you pick up American War, here's the thing. Again, I can't tell you if What Strange Paradise is a good or bad book. I can't do that with my own work. I do think it's a much better written book than American War. I think at a sentence level, there at least has been some improvement. I haven't just been spinning my wheels for the past, decade.
Did you ever
But American War,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Well, I was just wondering, did you ever cover any of the I don't know what the best way to refer to it as, but the sort of migration of people in the early 2010s to European countries? Was that part of your beat at all, or your assignments?
Yeah, it was at the tail end. So my first experience doing that was in Afghanistan. There were mass migrations of human beings as a result of war. A lot of them were internally displaced. And then later on, because I was born in Egypt and I grew up in the Middle East, I ended up on a lot of these stories because of my background, if I'm being perfectly honest. The same reason I ended up on a lot of terrorism stories. They were like, hey, there's a bunch of brown people involved in this terrorism story. Bring on one of the 2 brown guys we have in the newsroom. I remember I was hired on at the Globe and Mail in the summer of 2006. And I started on the Monday. And on that Friday, we had the largest terrorism arrest in Canadian history. And the Globe got beaten on that story. And the Globe is kind of like the New York Times of Canada. It's a big deal in Canada. And we got destroyed. The other 2 major newspapers had front page coverage. We had an item on A2. This is brief. We got beaten so badly, you can actually go look up a New York Times story on how badly the Globe was beaten on this story, which doesn't happen often, right? Anyway, the following Monday, the editor-in-chief has an all-hands-on-deck meeting, and he's looking for anyone with experience with Islam, anyone with experience in the Middle East, because the people who were involved in this plot, their parents were from the Middle East. He's looking for brown people. And in the newsroom of 300, he finds 2 of us. He finds me, and he finds Kamal, the theater critic.
Yeah.
So he calls us over, and he says, you 2, you're going to go to the mosques where these kids went. You're going to do some street reporting. It's like, okay, cool. So I go to one mosque. Kamal, the theater critic, goes to the other mosque. We come back. I'm writing my file, and Kamal gives me his file, which is 500 of the most beautiful words I've ever read on the acoustics and the texture of the velvet drapes. And because he's a goddamn theater critic, he just happened to be pulled into this story for which he had no expertise with. Anyway, so it was that kind of existence for 10 years, where it'd be like, hey, this story sounds like it could use a guy named Omar. How many guys named Omar do we have? Oh, 1. Okay, bring him. So for certain stories, I didn't want to do it, and for certain stories, I agitated for a long time before they decided. And the migration beat was one of those. Particularly post-Arab Spring, I was constantly pitching stories on that. And it's just a matter of, all news is local, right? So it's a matter of when you're going to pitch to the foreign editor, you have to find some Canadian angle or some Western angle or something to, like, every journalist learns those tricks. You learn the way that you can sort of sneak it by. I'm not going to bother with a curling analogy, but you understand what I'm talking about. You want to get it past the editor and get into the paper. You've got to figure out some way to make it appealing at the morning meeting. And so I would do a lot of that on the migration stories. And, I got lucky a couple of times to do that. But yeah, it was, sorry, that's my very rambling version of yes, I did cover those.
Yeah. Well, and then this is a yes or no question, which I know you're not supposed to ask. And also I see Caitlin. Caitlin, this is my last one, but like,
no, like take your time. You're good. I am reluctant to reappear. So please.
I just want to know, like, there's so many details in the story of Amir and the other people that are on the fishing boat getting, which then that journey takes the majority of the book, 50% of the book thread throughout. like when like cell phones coming in and out of reception, and the idea that there are lots of different people from all over the planet having like these intense philosophical discussions, or you know, just like strange kind of shady things that might happen with people who are accepting money to transport folks. Like I'm assuming that some of that information came from work as a journalist. It just seems too detailed to have been able to research in any other way. Is that the case, or am I just being naive?
No, I mean, a lot of it is, I mean, I traffic in theft. I traffic in wholesale theft. That's what I do. I make
Yeah.
things up and then I steal from real life. But so yeah, there's for example, early on, I'm not really spoiling anything here, but early on it becomes apparent that a lot of the book takes place on this passage. There's people on a boat and they're trying to get to the Mediterranean, trying to get to Europe, and they're wearing these life vests. And it becomes apparent that the life vests sold to them by the smugglers are full of foam and will actually do the exact opposite of what they're supposed to do if you fall. That's a real thing that happens. There's a point where someone's watching TV on this island, and there's a politician who's very anti-immigration who's talking about this child, and so um, the interviewer is asking, like, do you really think um, that these incredibly hardline positions that you're taking should also apply to someone like this child? And in his answer, the politician would only refer to the child as it. Um, that's a real thing. That was from a real interview. Another politician who was asking about, well, these women in these camps who show up here, if they're so destitute and everything's so bad, why do they keep asking for birth control pills?
Right.
If these people are so poor when they get here, why do they have cell phones? Like an understanding of the world whereby if you exist in this level, in this subclass, being alive is a privilege. Anything beyond existing is a luxury. All of that stuff was pulled from things that were, one of the problems with a lot of my writing is that I have to keep it from being too heavy-handed while trying to describe a reality that's more heavy-handed than my books. And I don't know how to do that conceptually, but yeah, there's a lot of what's in here that I picked up along the way while covering these stories.
Okay, last question. It's related. Then what Strange Paradise and putting What Strange Paradise together do for your overall inquiry into this that the work as a journalist couldn't do?
I think same thing that American War did for me personally, which is allow me to operate in a space where you don't have to have answers. Journalism by definition is about answers: who, what, where, when, how. If you don't have answers to these questions, you don't have a piece of journalism. But you can go into fiction and you can leave all of that hanging and you'll be fine. The book that influenced me the most when I was writing this thing is a book called The Wandering Jews, which was written about 100 years ago. It's about the Jews of Eastern Europe who were facing immense persecution, trying to get to the West, got to the West only to face an entirely different kind of persecution. And reading that book and seeing the echoes, the exact sort of, it felt like a mirror across 100 years. And the sense that so little has changed drove a lot of the writing of this book. It's at the end of the day, you put your residual experiences from the world you witness into the novel. And if none of it makes sense after the fact, you can claim poetic license and you get away with it, which is an amazing privilege of writing fiction.
And there's questions that answering them would not do the service to the context in which those questions were asked.
Yeah.
Some
And
questions.
if worse comes to worse, my literary genius is a valid answer to any question about why a book doesn't work or what the hell you're trying to do. You just get away with that and then run out the room before anybody digs too deep.
Just run out and do some curling.
Yeah, run out.
So this has been really wonderful. And I think like myself, the audience has just been kind of like, there's not too many questions, but so one, I just want to like defend you about getting lost on the square. When I first moved here, like I was constantly getting turned around, and if you tried to rely on at least when I a few years ago when I first moved here, if you try to rely on Google Maps or Apple Maps, it will make it worse. So it really was worth the wait. It was an incredible event. We do in the before times 150 events a year, and I'm not just saying this, but it was really memorable, and important event. And I definitely kind of, because it was right after Trump got elected, and I felt better sort of after your talk, speaking for me. But and also I just want to kind of, this isn't really a question, it's just kind of like, I love this, and I hadn't really thought about it until you started talking about it. But I think this kind of like journalism background married with like your affinity for allegory is wonderful, and like a great kind of like gateway drug for readers to really kind of deal with and sit with some heavy stuff. And it's not easy to, you know what I mean, because I mean, like you mentioned that the whole world was outraged for a day or two after that boat sank. And I mean, I think some of it is just callousness, but also it's hard to hold that in your head, in your heart. And I think that, I mean, this is such a cheesy bookseller thing to say, but like that's what makes your work and books in general so wonderful and important, because it's like a good space to really explore and understand and again sit with stuff that's really hard and too big for really one person to make any kind of meaningful change. But that doesn't mean that you I'm sorry, I just like feeling feelings. But I do have three questions. One of them is, again, like, so with the kind of, and I realize that for like long form journalism, and it's not like you were sitting it down, writing and publishing it, but the relatively quick turnaround for a journalistic piece versus kind of the long slog publishing a novel. Is there one that you prefer over the other, or is it just kind of like apples and flaming hot Cheetos? Like there's just no comparison at all.
Yeah, I mean, it is a little like apples and flaming hot Cheetos in that I tend to eat them both at the same time. It's weird, right? You do for 10 years, I was used to the whole like have it to me yesterday kind of thing, right? Which is what all, we need this, this, and this, we need it by deadline. Deadline's already passed. And so you build up a tolerance for that. And then the first time I went for an editorial meeting after Knopf bought American War, they sit you down in this room where 4 editors spend 2 hours telling you everything that's wrong with the book. It's just sort of like you walk out of there a different person. But at the end of this, they're like, okay, so here's 20 pages of notes on what we want you to change. See you in 6 months. And nobody had ever said see you in 6 months to me before. It was this weird whiplash. Like I just couldn't deal with it psychologically. And now I appreciate both. I appreciate the quick turnaround, because the other thing is that they have a similar lifespan on the other side of the work. So I recently wrote this piece for my old newspaper about climate-driven migration. And again, for about 48 hours, my Twitter feed is going crazy. People are linking to it. I'm getting all kinds of feedback, emails, and then it disappears. Whereas I still get about 1 or 2 emails a month about American War. Like it's had that incredibly long tail. So I like having both of those modes in my life. I'm happy in both places.
Wonderful. Okay, and now this is kind of a mean question, and you can say pass, but like, and Elena, I'd love to hear your answer too, if you like. What are you working on? What's next? Again, I realize it's incredibly cruel to ask on a book tour, but if there's something you'd like to share, we'd love to hear it.
Elena, you go first.
I'm writing about Elvis Presley, who grew up not far from Square Books.
Yes, so that's why you were in Tupelo. Okay.
That's why I was in Tupelo.
Makes sense.
He's officially been dead longer than he was alive as of last year. So I'm kind of taking stock of, how people are remembering him, and how this legacy that's older than he is maybe telling a different story than the actual human person who lived from 1935 to 1977.
I'm really excited to read that, and I don't know, like I feel compelled to share like my mom's Elvis stories, but they're not actually interesting. They're not real, but she just remembers where she was, and she had one of his scarves, but my grandfather made her give it to his girlfriend at the time, and she's never forgiven him. She caught it like at a concert.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
one of my favorite things is that not everyone, people who are your age and even Omar's age, don't have an Elvis story. But if somebody looks around the age of my mother, they have them. One of the best ones I ever got, and I won't tell it here because that's not what this event is all about, but was from a news person, a newsman who kind of was like Omar was at the very beginning of his career. And he was working in the basement of the LA Times the day that Elvis died, and sort of talked about what had to happen in order to get that on the front page as soon as possible. It's an incredible story. I'll save it for later though, because I want to know what Omar's working on. Maybe he's napping. What are you doing? Curling book. I'm hoping curling book.
No, I'm also writing about Elvis. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Sorry. Christ, that's going to be so good. That's going to be so good.
I know.
If you haven't read, my first experience of Elena's writing was Animal Strike Curious Poses, which still, I can never say that title and not have the song stuck in my head. Never. It's never going to be the case that I don't just have like, dig if you will. Anyway, but this will come as a surprise to people who are familiar with my stone cold bummer fiction, but I've been writing comedy, a lot of comedy. I wrote an audio series that's currently not selling to somebody. Somebody has it, some production company has it, and I haven't heard back from them. I assume it's for all the worst reasons. And then I have oh yeah, I will be on Livewire. I have a short story in this anthology that's coming out in September. There's this group in New York called Selected Shorts, and what they do is they have actors read these short stories to a live audience. And so they asked me 2 years ago, they asked me to be part of their 35th anniversary, which was supposed to be last year. So I started writing a short story, and it was going to be one of my usual like super depressing, bum you out kind of things. But it was in the early days of the pandemic, and I was already super depressed. So instead, I wrote this incredibly juvenile parody of the commercials, like, you know, the early days of the pandemic where it's like, from my family, yours, in a difficult time, please buy Toyota. Like it was that. And again, the jokes were dated like a week after I wrote them. And this thing kept getting postponed because of COVID. It's now set for spring 2022, and they're publishing an anthology. And as best I can tell, every other story in this anthology is serious, depressing literature by really famous, important writers. And then there's my ridiculous thing that, so anyway, that's, if the career doesn't come to a hard end right before then it definitely, that's going to be the end of it.
Doesn't that mean too that like a famous actor is going to read the story in some public?
God, I hope so. I hope it's like Meryl Streep or like,
yeah!
I don't know who they're going to get, but I really hope it's somebody who can withstand that kind of, like, who has enough fame that they can withstand the reading of this ridiculous nonsense.
I'm excited for that. Okay, so this is my last question. What is the name of your wife's curling team, and how do they do?
So she curls out at the Evergreen Curling Club, which is the best and only curling club in Portland. And they went to, I want to say regionals, but I honestly, I don't know what they did. The Northwest has like a beer curling tournament or something where everybody gets drunk and nobody makes it past the third end sort of thing. Oh yeah, curling also deals in ends, not like innings or, you know, quarters or whatever. They deal in ends.
I love that.
She's Canadian, so she's already got that going for her.
Well, I remember getting like really interested in curling like a few Olympics ago, because I was like, this is the only way I could ever possibly win a gold medal. But you know, there's no curling teams in Mississippi. But unfortunately, enough about
sounds like the title of the saddest poetry collection of all time.
So I just kind of want to do a close-up on this beautiful book. I mean, Knopf always does such a wonderful job, but they really nailed it. And we do have with love from us, with gratitude, signed bookplate editions. That is our, you know, kind of COVID workaround for signed copies, since we can't welcome back to Oxford quite yet. But look forward to doing it, both of y'all. We're here, come see us. I would like to remind those joining us, we can't host author events in person, virtual, hybrid, whatever, without your support. And I can't imagine that you haven't, you know, this book's not already in your cart at squarebooks.com, but just in case it isn't, here's a little guilt trip. Buy it, read it, shop local, shop indie, I'd love to send it to you. You can buy it on our website, squarebooks.com. Come visit us in Oxford, Mississippi, 160 Courthouse Square. Give us a call. It's all on Google. And thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with us. And I really enjoyed this conversation. It's been really fun. And Omar, I hope that you get to do something fun and not at all book related as this tour wraps up, but I'm so glad that we got to be a part of it. Excited to welcome you for your next book. And then Elena, same to you. Elvis, it's matchmaking heaven. Anyway, but I think it's about dinner time for a lot of our readers, listeners, Zoomers. So I think it's time to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, attendees, readers, writers, whoever. All right, gonna wrap it up now. Okay, bye.